Hi, I'm Jo Frost. I'm really sorry if anyone was expecting Super Nanny. I am not her. But I am mum to 2 girls, wife to 1 husband. I live in London, Director of Communications and Engagement at the EA, which basically means I oversee all our storytelling, all our relationship building, and all our gospel sharing work. So most of my time is just twiddling my thumbs and saying, isn't Jesus great? It is an amazing job. It's a real privilege to be here this week. It has been amazing, hasn't it? It's the gathering, the opportunity to come together. It's that reimagining moment. It's the kick up the backside that sometimes we need. And it's the call to go again. And I've loved it. It's been a real privilege. So thank you so much for letting me gate crash. I'm always amazed, especially as we've come out of lockdown and we've come out of COVID and that crazy season, which is thankfully a few years ago now, that just how powerful it is to come together and remind ourselves that we're not alone, that actually that when we're serving in our communities and in our contexts, it can feel quite small. And actually, the gospel and the kingdom is never small. Our bit can feel quite tiny, and we can often feel a bit more like a mustard seed than a mustard tree. But when we come together, we are reminded that in unity and in the presence of God, God's kingdom comes, and together we make Jesus known. And I love it because I get to work for the EA, and that is our primary purpose, to just connect and unite and to gather and to celebrate and to share and to cheer on and to support. So that is me, that's the EA, and that's what I get the privilege of doing, but that is not why we are here today. So I thought that we would have a little bit of an icebreaker, so hopefully you're sat relatively near somebody to chat to. Gather around, you've got a couple of minutes, 1 minute, I'm going to be tight. 1 minute, come up with a working definition. What is communication? Okay, all right, so I've heard listening, I've heard talking, I've heard understanding, there's a flow, there's something about receiving as well as disseminating, and there's different forms of communication, written, verbal, physical. Okay, this is my definition. I spent hours on it. I hope you were impressed. There is a reason why I dropped art very early in my academic career. Okay, so for me, communication requires at least 2 parties. There is a message being sent and a message being responded to. So it is that flow, it is the passing between. Sometimes in communication, and I'm assuming in your leadership positions, you probably spend at least some of your time trying to communicate, it can feel a little bit like what you are passing out isn't necessarily being received and responded to. And what that can do is you feeling a little bit like this, that you're just desperately spinning round. I'm going to come off that because that gets a little bit dizzy. Have you ever noticed when you've got a preacher and they haven't quite worked out how they're going to close and land the preach, and they're getting a little bit more frustrated with you in the congregation because they know it's not quite landing, so they're reiterating what they're saying, and it just kind of swirls. You're struggling, they're struggling, and the communication just doesn't quite land. So communication isn't just the dissemination of information, but I think the word over here was understanding, that there has to be a kind of response to a communication in order for a communication to be effective. So when we're talking this morning about communicating the gospel into culture, there has to be a reciprocation, there has to be a landing, there has to be an understanding, there has to be a comprehension in order for that gospel to land in that space. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's point 1. What is communication? Point 2, spinning hamsters, is what is culture? If we're talking about communicating into culture, maybe we need a definition of what culture is. It's a word we use quite a lot. It won't come as a surprise. You've got 1 minute. Come up with a definition for me. What do you think culture is? Culture, I think we've heard quite a few times this idea that it's communal. that there is a group definition or an understanding. We talk about culture all the time. We talk about cultural icons, we talk about cultural moments, culture wars. My definition is that it's a shared set of stories, of habits, and of customs, and of stuff. You can have cultural artifacts, but it's collective. We build and we maintain culture together. It is the activity of making sense or building meaning into our lives. So it gives us a kind of a framework to operate. It's whether or not we high-five each other when we share the peace, or whether or not we hug, or whether or not we shake hands, whether or not you get a little tiny cup of communion, or whether or not somebody passes you a big beaker. There are little habits that we all adopt that help us navigate what is done. And different cultures have different sets of habits and of stories that make sense. In our culture today, we have foundation stories. We have lots of little stories, and we have lots of little cultures and lots of little spaces. Wherever you have community, you will have culture. But also we have wider societal cultural stories and wider societal flows. They are built by our foundation stories. They're the stories that we collectively build our lives upon and collectively make sense of. Now, I know a lot about foundations. I'm a homeowner in southwest London, which means that I spent an awful lot of money to live in an awfully small space. But I had the joy of the worst word any homeowner could ever hear when a structural engineer came over to inspect some cracks on my walls. I have subsidence. And subsidence basically means that there is a portion of the foundations on which my house is built that are slipping. The reason why they are slipping is because my house is right next to a very big oak tree. And that oak tree has very deep roots. And in summer, or when the temperature changes, the roots drop down and they suck the moisture out of the soil that my house is built upon. And so one bit of my house is falling down, and the walls and the structure of my home is twisting to try and keep standing, even though its foundations aren't strong enough or deep enough to hold it up. You can see it most clearly. There's a supporting wall in the middle of my lounge, and it's like a guy rope crack as my wall is being pulled taut to try and keep the external walls upright. The people in our communities are experiencing the cracks in our culture like subsidence cracks in our lives. Our foundations aren't deep enough, and they aren't strong enough to hold up our lives and our worlds. And our society is cracking under the pressure of insufficient stories to make sense of our lives and our world. We've seen it. We've seen the political turmoil. We've seen the economic crashes. We're facing up to environmental crises. We've seen the long-term impacts of COVID. We've seen increased inequality. We've seen strikes. We've seen depression. We've seen obesity. We've seen prescription drug use. We see social isolation, and we see loneliness. This is our world. These are the people that you care about. This is the person sat next to you. This is your own story. We see this everywhere. Subsidence cracks, because the foundation stories of our culture are not sufficient to build our lives upon. Our stories aren't strong enough. And it is my proposition this morning that in order to communicate into our gospel, we need to recognize that our cultural stories are weaker than we think, and that the God story is stronger than we think. That our God story is a foundation to build a life upon. We sang it this morning. And that is our invitation. That is our good news. So let's start by understanding a little bit about the stories that we encounter. For those of you who were with me yesterday, this may be a bit of a refresher course, but we have 3 stories. Secular story is the first story, but it doesn't get a slide, never mind. The secular story puts doubt and uncertainty, like, did I put the right slide in? About 500 years ago, we lived in a world where God was a given. We lived in a world where everybody knew their place. We lived in a world where the church and external authorities were absolute. They told us what to think, they told us what to believe, they told us which bits of science were true or heretical. The world made sense. But as we've already heard, when humans put their own power at the center of our world, it doesn't always go well. And the secular story arose as a reaction against the dominating and empire building of some of the religious authorities of the day. And they put doubt and skepticism at the heart of belief. Secularism isn't so much anti-God. It just says that all beliefs should be questioned. It puts skepticism at the start of it. Now, instead of it being unbelievable to believe in God, it's almost unthinkable. It's kind of quaint to believe in God. There's an innocence, there's a naivety, there's a, you still believe that attached to our story? We have ended up, therefore, in a contested world. Everybody is getting it. As soon as you assert one set of beliefs, somebody is going to turn around and say, I don't believe you, I think you are wrong, I think you are false, I think you are evil. We end up with a deplatforming, a cancel culture, we end up with tribals and culture wars and everybody screaming at each other. And everybody gets it. We feel it. The church feels it. But so does J.K. Rowling, so does Richard Dawkins. Arguably, it was Nicola Sturgeon's beliefs that were reason why she lost the leadership of the SNP, because her contestability of her beliefs were her downfall. Doubt is at the center of our stories. What that leaves is that our stories become really fragile. It means that in your community and in your society, doubters are tempted to believe. I don't believe in God, but I miss him, is a story we hear. That people are tempted to ask deeper, more profound questions because the world doesn't always seem to have very good answers. But it also means that in our communities, believers are tempted to doubt. There's a fragility to our faith that can lead to deconstruction, that can lead to questions, that can lead to a whole host of discipleship questions, because doubt is a foundation to which we build our lives upon. The second story is the individual story. As doubt and the uncertainty of the world around us starts to swarm, the only person left to believe in and to put our trust in is ourselves. We have to be the center of our world. We are the primary unit of concern and meaning, and so my feelings, my inner life, my thoughts, my desires, my self-expression become the foundation of the world that we inhabit. God is replaced with me. We therefore live in a world of authenticity. We must be authentic to ourselves. We must be true to ourselves. We must speak our truth, live our truth, be the best self, do the best thing. Everything in my own immediate world supports my deep belief that I am the center of the universe. So I get to pick and choose what I like. How was the sermon? Oh, wow, it really impacted me. How was the worship? Didn't really feel it today. What was the church like? Oh, well, it didn't really have a lot for me. Or, oh, yeah, it's a place where I feel that I can really use my gifts. We hear it in the church and outside of the church, all over. What is this giving me? And how is this facilitating me to express myself? It also means that there is this place of facilitation. That the role of authority, the role of schools, of churches, and of leadership isn't to shape or to form or to impose a set of beliefs or a theology or a way of living, but to simply provide a platform or a space or a stage for someone to flourish, to be their best selves, to be protected in order to manifest who they are and what they're about. We get to write our own scripts, be true to ourselves. But it puts an awful lot of pressure on the individual to know what is good, what is true, and what is right. It's all on you. Which means that we end up then with the postmodern story. The postmodern story rejects the certainty of modernity, this idea that science and rationalism was going to have all the answers. And the 20th century was a pretty strong indictment that humanity really doesn't have all the answers. In fact, we ended up with a bit of a mess. So postmodernism came along and said power and hierarchy and institution, they need to be torn down. They need to be deconstructed. That we can't trust the institutions, they are on the wrong side of history. And there is something really beautiful about those truths. There's something really powerful and redemptive about those truths. But by privileging a story of doubt and by privileging a story of me, all truth then becomes perspective. All truth then becomes interpretation and subjective. That's my truth. That's true for me. So Jesus means a lot to you, but that's fine. That's up to you. Don't impose your beliefs on me. I'm going to do what's true for me. We live in a post-truth world where lies become spin and objectivity becomes interpretation. And I don't know about you, but all of these stories, all of these questions, all of this doubt, all of this fragility, all of this contestability, it just feels like a lot. It feels relentless, and it feels overwhelming, and it feels like I don't know where to put my feet. I feel like I'm walking on cracking ground all the time. Am I going to be heard wrong? Am I going to misspeak? Am I going to say something offensive? Am I going to be unkind and not even realize it? How do I honor the person in front of me when my understanding of what honoring looks like could be completely opposed to what they see? How do we navigate this world? How do we communicate in a way that is understood? It feels really challenging. And this is the world that we are living in. And for so many, it's overwhelming. Anxiety is on the rise, depression's on the rise. Simply, we search for opportunities for control, to opt out, or to point the finger and find somebody to blame. Our foundation stories are not strong enough, and we are experiencing the cracks everywhere. So my question is, if these stories aren't working, why aren't people flocking to the gospel? The story we think is the most powerful. But before we get there, I'd like to just pause a minute and ask you some questions about these stories that we are encountering before we get to the God story. So, first question, of the three, the secular story, the individual story, and the postmodern story, which stories do you encounter? Which stories do you bump into most frequently? And what effects have you seen, positive or negative, these stories have in the lives of those around you? You've got about 5 minutes to have a chat. Turn to the people next to you, and I'll call you back in a minute. Interesting, and it is interesting. It is interesting, the generational shifts. It's interesting, the cultural spaces, the subcultures, the micro stories, the little microcosms of culture and formation, how these stories spread and where we engage. There is a multiplicity and a complexity around our cultural stories because they aren't shared. There isn't one agreed narrative. So they all come in and they all compete with each other and they all fight with each other and it's all fun. isn't it? So how do we communicate in this space? How do we share a better story, a more powerful story? And why isn't our story cutting through? Why isn't the gospel the most persuasive and powerful story out there? Why does it feel sometimes that our Christian story is also too weak to handle what life throws at us? Could it be that we have maybe shrunk our story and been swept along a little bit with the cultural currents, that we have little to offer? Perhaps we have too often in churches shared a gospel of letting Jesus into our hearts rather than a story of God at work in the cosmos and in the universe, inviting us into his ongoing story of redemption, the larger story of creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. Perhaps we have opted to help people understand our story for a simpler story than the God story. I don't know about you, but certainly as I've trained as an evangelist and I've gone out and done gospel presentations, sometimes I am taught a very short story, nice simple one. It starts with sin and it ends with Jesus on a cross. It starts with the fall and it ends with redemption. I have a problem. Jesus is my solution. I am a sinner. Jesus died to set me free. And although this gospel is true, it's truncated. It's just a bit of it. It's too small. This half gospel leads to an individual's salvation. It's reduced to saving souls for heaven. Pop your ticket in your pocket, wait till you die, and you're all sorted. If life is hard now, don't worry. It might suck a little bit to be you, but when you get there, all will be well. We just end up twiddling our thumbs and waiting to die. It also starts with sin, which isn't where our story starts. If we don't start with an originally good world, then we have no reason to hope for better. The Christianity of William Wilberforce, Amy Carmichael, and Martin Luther King needed a full gospel. It needed a gospel that wasn't just about saving souls, but about full cultural renewal. We cannot live fully human lives, and we cannot share a gospel that invites people to be truly fully human if the gospel story is limited to individual salvation and heaven when we die. Now, there can be two responses to the half story, the sinner saved story. One is that our culture doesn't really like the idea of us being sinners. It doesn't really like with the idea that you might have done anything wrong. And so we can end up with a quarter story, a story that just says God loves you, God accepts you, and God welcomes you into his world. Job done. But the problem is that quarter story, again, while true, is so weak. What do you do with guilt? What do you do with shame? What do you do with forgiveness? How on earth do you encounter the redemptive, sanctifying, justifying grace of Jesus if God simply blanketly accepts us wherever we are and whatever our world looks like? It's just not strong enough. It's not the gospel at all. The other option, and in my world, the only option, is to dig deep foundations into the God story, into the rich, nuanced, complex story of who God is and who we are made to be in him. Now, how you start a story and how you end a story affects the story that you are telling. Our story starts in a garden. Our story starts with a being, the most beautiful, benevolent, powerful, and gracious being that danced across eternity. This being, this God, this person's three in one, was, is, and always will be united in an infinite relationship of love, of sacrifice, and of generosity. And everywhere this God went, life spilt out. Creation overflowed like a fountain, unable to contain its exuberance. Intentionality, abundance, and sheer unbridled joy brought all things into creation. And over it all he spoke goodness. It is good, it is good, it is good. The centerpiece of this epic symphony was humanity. Man and woman, infused with the very breath of life itself, made in the image and likeness of God. They stood at the heart of creation, and all was as it should be. Creative, dynamic, relational, powerful creatures. Humanity was modeled and molded on the nature and character of God. We're able to bless, steward, order, and nurture the created world around us. This is peace, and all is well. This is the foundation story. This is where we start to see the truth of who we are. No matter what your world is, and no matter what the world is like of the people with whom you are trying to share the good news of Jesus, our story started well. And if our story starts well, there is hope. There is hope that our story will be well too. In the beginning, we hear this idea that we are made in the likeness and character of God. And we hear that in this phrase, we are image bearers. Now, it's one of those wonderful Christian phrases that I would not recommend using in a gospel presentation. So what does it mean, and why is it so powerful? Now, has anyone here ever met the King? Anyone met King, or maybe Prince as he was? Charles? Any hands? Oh, yeah, thanks, Emma. Just us. We got to meet him. I say meet. He walked past me looking in entirely the opposite direction, but I am claiming it. Now, if King Charles was to walk through the doors behind us, how many here would need to be introduced to find out who he is? Or would you recognize him? I think every single one of us here would recognize him instantly. Why? Because we have all seen countless objects bearing his image. 1 billion screens bore his image on Saturday. Stamps, coins, t-shirts, masks. We have seen his likeness all of our lives. We know who he is because we have seen objects that resemble him before. An object that bears another's image is not actually the image itself. It's not a clone, it's not a repeat. Rather, it is a representation, a reflection, a signpost pointing back to the original object. Image bearers represent, project, and share in the image's likeness. We, humanity, is created to be God's image bearers. We come from dust, but we are invited to more. We get to represent, project, and share in his likeness, to be like him and do what he does. This is our gospel. This is who every single person that you have ever met was created to be. To be like God and to do what he does in relationship with him. This is our purpose, our mandate, our reason for being. We are to remind creation of who God is. We are to inspire the entirety of creation's worship. We are given authority over the works of God's hands, and we are pointing back creation back to its creator. This is the goodness at the start of our story. In the latest Talking Jesus research from 2022, We asked a new question. We asked, what are the questions that people are asking? And the questions that were posed were kind of your typical alpha questions. Who is God? Is Jesus real? Why is there suffering in the world? Do you know what the most common answer was, most common response to which of these questions are you asking as a non-Christian? None of the above. The church is answering questions that our communities and our culture aren't asking. But my goodness, are we asking big questions of life? We are asking questions about who we are and how we are to live. We're asking questions about what makes us happy, how to live a good and full life, about what does loving well look like. It asks questions about being successful or purpose, right and wrong, good and evil, injustice and violence in the world, and who to put our trust in. Our lives are peppered with big questions that form and shape how we live. Our culture has useless answers to these questions, and God has beautiful ones. So to help us navigate and communicate through those questions and offer some good news stories to them, I'd like to introduce you to the Being Human lens. The Being Human lens is a lens that asks these questions about what does it mean to be human. To be human is to be significant. You matter. You represent God himself. Humanity is important. But to be human is to be connected. It is not an I conversation, it is a we conversation. We matter to each other. To be human is to be physically, bodily, temporally here, in a place, in a season, in a time, physically. When we went into lockdown, we went virtual, and it didn't work. We are physical, temporal beings. It matters that we are together and that we are present. To be human is to be present in and of the world. And finally, to be human is to make a difference, to participate. The world is affected by your existence. You make a difference, and that matters. So we use this lens to look through the world and to see the world that we are inhabiting and we are encountering. At the center of this lens is a question around being human. And what I'd like to do is invite you that as you are sharing your gospel, your good news story into communities and into cultures and into people's lives, at the center point of that question, the center of our focus is the person of Jesus. Because Jesus shows us what it means to be human. He lived a truly, fully, beautifully human life. He is the only one to have done it. He is the only one to know that his significance comes exclusively from the Father. He is the only one to love generously, completely, selflessly, and bravely, so much so that he gave his life for his enemies, not just his friends. He is the only one to be the Emmanuel, the with us God, who dwells amongst his people. And he is the one to partner, to rule, wind, waves, even the dead obey his voice. He participates and makes a difference in our world. The life of Jesus shows us what it means to be human, and this is the gospel. Jesus is the human being that we were all made to be. Through all that he does, all that he says, he teaches, he demonstrates, and he creates a new way of being human. Hans Rumaker, Dutch theologian and apparently jazz player, says this line: Jesus did not die to make us Christian. He died to make us human. To be human is to be a representative and a projection and a participant in the character, the nature of God, to participate and be a part of the coming of his kingdom. This is the good news of Jesus. This is the story we get to communicate and help people understand. It's good. Do you remember how I said how you start a story and how you end a story affects the story that you're telling? Our story isn't finished yet, but our story ends not in a garden but in a city where life flows, where healing is known, where pain and sickness and death and mourning have no presence because God is with his people. Our story has not finished yet. Our story is certain. There is a new heaven and a new earth, and God will be with us. This is the truly beautiful good news that we get to live out and share with everyone we encounter. This is the certain hope and the firm foundation that we get to build our lives upon. So I just want to encourage you and bless you as you leave this space, as you represent God, as you project God's character and nature in the world around you, and as you share in what he does. You will know the God who knows you and loves you and invites you to partner with his kingdom come. And may you see the power of the gospel at work in your lives and in the lives around you. Communicate this beautiful truth and share this wonderful story because it is the hope of the world.